Good afternoon. Thank you very much for coming back from lunch so promptly. My name's Louise Bennett, and I'm chairing the first panel session this afternoon. I've put some things there that anyone can help themselves to, which are some publications from the BCS about identity assurance and payments on the internet, and our briefings to ministers on these topics. So do help yourself when you leave. We're just going to be talking and having a conversation among ourselves and with you, I trust, when we've all made our initial points. We're one down because, unfortunately, Susan Morrow is ill and not able to be here. I shall just introduce people by name when they speak. I just want to say a few words to start with. And that is that I felt as we went through the morning, we were in grave danger of concatenating too many thoughts and ideas and too many things together. And I'm a great believer in the keep it simple, stupid principle. And so I think it's very important that we have simple, robust systems that work. And you need simple, robust payment systems. And you need to know what is the essence of a payment system. And you need to know in which situations when you're making a payment that you either need to have identity assurance of some sort or simply age verification or verification of some other thing, like, for instance, if you're going to deliver something as an online retailer, you need verification of the address that you're going to deliver it to. So I'm going to start with some very, very simple points. First is, what does a buyer need to know if they're going to make a payment? The first thing that the buyer needs to know is that the online site that they're dealing with is indeed the one they think they're dealing with. It really is Marks and Spencer's and not some other site in some other country. They need to know they're not going to be defrauded, that they're going to get the goods, and if they don't get the goods or the goods are faulty, they need to know that they've got some redress and liability. And some of that liability and redress comes through using certain types of payments, which I'm sure the others will talk about. And it's all a question of risk-reward, about how careful the buyer is going to be about making the payment. Now, the seller needs to know before they send off the goods that they are actually going to get the payment from the purchaser. So they want confidence that they're going to be paid. And one way of doing this is ensuring that they pay by certain routes, which the seller has confidence in, or you can take the Alibaba method, which is having Alipay standing in escrow for that transaction. Sometimes the seller also needs to know, for legal reasons, what the age of the person is. And that's the real subject of today. And that really depends on the country that you're in and the product that you're selling and what kind of redress or liability there's going to be on you as a seller if you sell something to an underage person. Is it just going to be a tap on the wrist? Is it going to be a reputation problem? What is the problem for you if you haven't verified the age properly? Sometimes you need to know the actual identity of the person, and if you're going through a banking system, then the bank has done that because they have an obligation under regulations to know their customers. So you could be fairly certain that the bank knows the identity of the individual. And there may be all sorts of other things put on them about what country it's coming from, whether they're funding terrorism and all sorts of other things. And the final thing that I wanted to add to this is the question of, I used to say very, very strongly, in payments you can't have anonymity. But I've been convinced by the conversations on age verification that sometimes it's perfectly okay to have payments with anonymity. After all, payments with cash are anonymous, and payments when you just top up your digital wallet, pay with your Oyster card, can be anonymous. And finally, and I'm not going to talk about this, I'm involved on behalf of the BCS with the World Wide Web Consortium on developing open standards for payments over the internet to enable global e-commerce. And they have decided to separate. We started by doing payments and identity as one thing, and we said that's too complicated. We're going to separate them out, and we're going to have separate standards that are being developed for identity online and for payments online. So having said that, I'd like to ask Steve to make his points.
Thank you. My name is Steve PANNIFER. I'm from Consult HYPERION. Now, we're a consultancy, and we usually say that we work in payments and identity, but I think it would be quite helpful today to maybe define it or describe us differently, and to describe us as an identity consulting firm who happens to apply that identity knowledge into payments. The reason for making that point is, let me explain. So when we think about payments, a lot of what we're talking about is often actually identity and authentication. So think about a card payment, for example. Obviously, to get the card, you're going to be KYC'd. The bank needs to know who you are. And then when you make a transaction with the card, there's a whole bunch of authentication processes going on. The card's demonstrating to the terminal and to the bank that it's genuine. If you enter a PIN, then you're authenticating yourself to the card, potentially, maybe to the bank, depending how it's done. So there's a whole bunch of identity and authentication things going on. And actually, the payment doesn't occur, the actual transfer of funds don't occur until much later on, perhaps an overnight clearing process. So it's clear that in payments, identity and authentication is very, very important. Now, that doesn't mean that payments necessarily make a good authentication or a good identity tool. To give you a bad example, or poor example, if we think about a card not present payment, so an e-commerce payment, for example, currently, now this is changing, but currently, often when you make such a payment, you need to hand over information such as your name, your address, postcode, in order for that payment to be authenticated. I use the word authenticated in the broader sense there. That can create a problem, because actually what you're doing is you're divulging information about yourself, which strictly speaking isn't at all necessary for that payment to occur. Why should I have to assert my address in order to demonstrate that I've got sufficient funds, and I'm entitled to access a particular account? The two are unrelated. And that's where you end up with the kinds of problems that were kind of referenced to this morning with, for example, Ashley Madison. So the reason that breach was so significant was that there wasn't minimal disclosure when people signed up to that site. They were required to enter card details, required to put a card on file to pay for services. And presumably, Ashley Madison also were using that as a proxy for age verification as well. But what that meant was there was much more information being held by them than strictly speaking was necessary. And obviously, we all know what's been going on in the news about that data breach and how damaging it's been to individuals concerned. So I guess my main point today is that payments and ability to pay, I think my view is you need to treat it as another identity attribute alongside age, or perhaps alongside, I don't know, citizenship or something, the fact that you're a company director, who knows, whatever attributes you might think of. And it's really about putting the cart before the horse, or sorry, the horse before the cart. Getting the cart and the horse the right way around, right? Got it right the first time. The point is that payments don't enable identity. It's identity that enable payments. And I think if we model those things up, you can end up with unintended consequences. So that's kind of what I wanted to say, really.
Thanks very much, Steve. If you could pass it on to Helen.
Okay. Hello, I'm Helen Doyle. I'm Director of research and customer policy at Payments UK. For those of you who don't know us, we're the new trade association for the growing and rapidly evolving payments industry in the UK. And my role is really about helping the industry to work together to make payment services work better for customers and do what customers want payment services to do by making sure we have the research and evidence to understand what customers want and keeping those requirements front of mind in all the industry developments. So I come to this issue of online age verification actually not from a sort of technical question of is it possible to use payments to do this, but more sort of how will customers feel about using payments to do this for them, or would they actually prefer to be verifying their age through a different means and sort of keeping the payment and the verification separate. And I know there was a point in the previous panel about the importance of transparency and building trust, and that really resonated with me. But if we do want payments to be doing this, how do we make it work in a way that provides that verification with the speed, certainty, and crucially the customer control over that record and how that information is shared and so on in a way that is truly informed and transparent? I think there are some sort of real clear potential benefits to using payments to verify age, but there are also some challenges and some sort of words of caution, points that I wanted to make. And I suppose sort of ID verification of any kind with age or other attributes and using the payment to do that is an additional requirement on a service which wasn't originally designed to do that, and conflating it could have unintended consequences, knock-on impacts, etc. And both for how you can evolve payments in the future and also how you can evolve ID verification in the future. And we don't want to do anything that's going to restrict how these things will need to change in the future. I think it's also important that we don't assume that using the payment will give the best experience for the customer or the commercial organisation that needs that information. And, you know, I mean, I suppose sort of another point around this is that sometimes when, as a consumer, we want to verify our ID, we might actually not be doing that to pay for something. And the adult content is the example there. I think that point was made this morning as well, that somebody may need to be verifying that they're over 18 in order to view something, but it might not be something that they're actually going to pay for. So I suppose sort of my point really is that although the payment might be the right answer or one answer to how age can be verified, I think it is sort of healthy to kind of sort of have some distance there and sort of approach it with caution. But the environment is changing. Some of you will be aware of the HM Treasury Act activity on data sharing and open APIs, and also that there is the second Payment Services Directive is on its way, and that both of those activities mean that we are moving to an environment where it is going to be possible for banks to support ID verification in the future through data sharing or offering an attribute checking service. And there's no certainty around how those are going to change in the future, but it should mean that the environment is moving in the right direction. And I think crucially, it's also those two developments do mean that customers are going to become accustomed to consenting to having bank data used to access new types of services, which means I think we will see a bit of a shift in terms of how customers feel about this in the future, sort of away from perhaps where they feel caution at the moment to sort of a greater degree of confidence in the future.
Thank you very much, Helen. Peter, could we hear what your main points are?
Okay, Peter Seymour, I'm sort of independent, but I did formerly work for VocalLink for about 14 years, so I probably know a few things around payments. I suppose listening to this morning's session and some of the comments that have been made as well, we mustn't mix up or conflate the identity and the age verification point, and therefore I think we also mustn't confuse what might be a sort of Facebook 13 sort of years verification with a sort of over 18 and making a payment as well. So if we are looking at purely the payment space, then in that case, I do believe there is an opportunity for the payment to actually act as the point of verification as well. And the bits that Helen mentioned around PSD2 and APIs, they might be part of the solution as well. But equally, we also have a new payment service regulator as well coming on board. So I think there is definitely something in that regulation space, and the new PSR, should be really trying to actually appreciate that if the payment systems can offer a support around verification, and that support really has to be something that says that any of us as a consumer want to have hopefully a friction-free experience on the web whenever we buy something. So if we are trying to create the right consumer experience, and the sort of transactions we're talking about, yes, money is exchanging. If it's on the web, it's not going to be cash. It is going to be using cards and things, and mobile will also come into this picture in time as well. And none of us quite know how mobile payments will or will not work. But you've got to be using the regulator in that case to be establishing the right framework. The regulator, therefore, if age verification is something that is going to be included within the payment infrastructure, the regulator, therefore, has also got to be making a determination on what needs to be collaborative and what needs to be competitive. And until we actually get a bit of direction, it's going to be very difficult for, I think, any of us to really know where to focus our energies. And yes, there's good works going on, the DPA looking at standards and so on, but that's just the standard. The standard then has to be utilised and used, and that really is where the new payments regulator has to come on board and actually trying to establish, therefore, what that framework is that banks, whether it be Payments UK or whatever, all the other stakeholders are. So how will that work? So how can you, therefore, as a consumer, in a very frictionless way, make a payment, and at the same time as making the payment, hopefully have verified that you are, and all the good things we were talking about this morning, which it isn't about passing across personal information. It is just actually using the confidence that the provider of that payment service, and whether it's the card network or a bank, is able, and you can trust the fact that they are letting you know that the person using that card, is within or above the age range to buy that particular product. And that shouldn't be a simple ambition for us all to try and have. I know underneath then to achieve and actually make it work, there's some technical stuff around it, but we haven't yet answered, in my belief, the questions around what is collaborative, what is competitive, and we haven't really got what I would call a good regulatory or government steer on at least where that line should be drawn and which parties, banks and others, certainly around the payment space, ought to be stepping up to the mark and what they should be actually doing in order to support this.
Thank you very much. And finally, if we could hear from you, Sarah.
So, hi, my name's Sarah MUNRO. I'm from Barclays Bank, and we're the first bank in the UK to become an identity provider as the gov.uk Verify scheme. We're part of the scheme because we believe in the future of the identity market, and we believe that we can help connect our customers in the digital world in a very safe way, and we've decided to become an identity provider to help prove that case. But I don't think that and we also believe that there is a really strong connection between identity and payments, but I don't think, as much as the panel has already indicated, that these problems are solved. So I think, as part of the gov.uk programme, they've got levels of assurance. Whereas if you think about how we operate in the real world, what we need to think about is what's the risk-based approach. So if you're an e-commerce merchant, your ambition is to manage your compliance against having a frictionless experience. So as an e-commerce merchant, if you've got lots of things put in front of you that make it harder for your customers to connect, or you'll have high abandonment rate. So how can you connect the attribute of payment and the attribute of identity together? And the issue for the banks at the moment is that those data sets are often very separate. So I might have an age attribute that sits somewhere in a customer database, and I've got a payment services provider, and those two things aren't connected. So I think the other issue really is about, as Peter was saying, it's a very fragmented market. So Barclays has become an identity provider to government, but nobody else has. And that's fine because everyone has different drives and ambitions. Everyone has different strategic agendas. But if you want the payment service providers and the banks to provide solutions for this, I think there needs to be a regulatory approach that says, actually, we need you to do this, we need you to participate in this way, because otherwise the market will continue to maintain to be fragmented.
Thank you very much. I think there's one point there which we can perhaps bring to the attention of Merlin, Errol and Rachel, and that is the importance of the DPA has got an opportunity to get ministers and so on to actually look at the regulatory framework. And I think in payments, people are used to working in a regulatory framework, and exactly what that should be is very important. Before I open questions to the floor, I just want to ask one question that sort of links to something that was touched on but not covered much before lunch, and that is the monetisation of attributes. And the monetisation of attributes in relation to payment systems. What is your feeling on that?
It's a very interesting question because if you look at some of the wallet initiatives that have come and gone in the last 3 or 4 years, for a lot of them, the business case was built around the data, because payments is a very low margin business, and so the people that were bringing those products to market were looking to accumulate data and monetize it. So I think it is a very kind of relevant question to ask. In terms of my own personal view, I'm a consumer, I'm a citizen. I want my own privacy to be preserved. That has to be balanced against my appetite for receiving marketing and so forth. And I don't think there is necessarily a clear boundary that you can draw between those two things. What I would say is, as a consumer, I'd like to have a little bit of control to be able to sort of set the dial myself. And I think sometimes, at least in the recent experience, maybe it's changing a bit, I hope, the dial was too far in one direction and it was out of the control of the consumer. So I think as a payments industry, we need to think better about where we set that dial and maybe giving more control to consumers.
So I think the monetisation issue is, I'm not sure where the money lies, actually. I think there's lots of people in this room all operating in the same space, figuring out where is the money going to come from. I think when we think about it, it might be about not monetisation as I'm paying for an attribute, but it's about reducing the friction, improving the compliance, and making the ecosystem more trusted. And by having that, you have more participation, more people. At the moment, I think 97% of all mobile carts get abandoned because ordering something on your mobile phone and then trying to deliver it, put in your address, and all, it's just pointless and painless. So if you can have single sign-on, reduce the friction, that's where the value comes in, rather than saying I'm going to pay a customer for their attribute. It's about making their experience better, that they better engage with the brands that participate in the program.
I was just going to say that you can look at it from two ways. So a business that has an obligation to check someone's age before they can sell something, by its very nature, they could be paying a part of a pence or whatever else it might be for that to happen. But equally, if I am a customer of a bank and I'm using the bank systems to buy things and so on, and why can't I, make sure that I tick the right box, and when I'm using the bank systems to pay for something, then whether it be my address and things are seamlessly in a frictionless way, going across onto that screen, verifying I'm over 18 or whatever else. So you could look at it from both ways, but I do think there is a business model as well. And there is a business model where people who have got attributes, could be confirming, certainly from an age perspective, that someone is or isn't above a certain age or below a certain age or whatever it might be. And therefore, there is a business model there as well.
As someone who works for a trade association, our legal team tend to get a bit nervous every time I talk about anything that's commercial rather than collaborative, so I probably won't say too much. But I think really just to echo sort of Sarah's point, it's sort of, I think all of this has got to start with the customer experience here and what consumers want out of this, and customer experience, also what the merchants need out of this, and actually that's where the value lies, and if that's monetised for business purposes, then that's sort of clearly within the competitive space. But getting better customer experiences around all of this has to be the starting point.
Are there any questions from the floor? Have they all gone to sleep? Oh, there's someone at the back. Oh, okay. Right. I'm not going to leap down like the previous person did.
Thank you. Put your hand up again.
Should let ladies go first.
Thank you very much. Hello, I'm Catherine Devlin from the Electronic Cigarette Industry Trade Association. Just a couple of things. Thank you all very much. Extremely interesting panel. Helen, I think, made some very good points about future-proofing. And I guess maybe because we're both from a trade association point of view. We obviously, I agree, we don't want to be looking at restricting any future innovation in the ID verification space or the age verification space, or indeed in payment service provision or anything else. But I have a bit of a concern about Peter's points about payment service as the solution, because that wouldn't work in all of those e-commerce environments where the products and services are such that you don't want them being viewed by minors. And for example, in adult content, but potentially for e-cigarettes, we don't yet know exactly what is going to be required of the legislation that's coming in for our sector with the age restriction. It may be that actually what we don't want is, well, certainly in real terms, what we don't want is minors getting in and looking at vaping products and sort of getting ideas that they want them. And all of that would potentially happen long before you get to the payment point in the transaction. So I think, we maybe need to be looking at solutions that can work with service provision alongside perhaps gateway solutions as well.
Who'd like to respond to that first?
I'll just pick up. I think the difficulty you always have gotten around this, if you're trying to solve every single problem. So I think from a pure payment perspective, there is something that could happen there. I'm not saying there aren't other solutions that are required for what might be people viewing sites and looking at stuff and so on, ahead of buying and purchasing. But there are certain transactions, where, you are doing the payment and that could be verified. So there's going to be a mixed economy. I think if we all sit here and think we're going to find a single solution that can solve every single potential use case where age verification, is needed, I think we're going to be sitting here a long, long time trying to find it. So there is something about if there is an easier journey to try and, work through first and get something out there, and if that provides some standards that can be reused elsewhere, then that's great.
Yeah, I mean, I think to pick up on Peter's point, I think we have to think about what good architectures and what good design looks like. It may not be achievable today, but we have to think about that so that we can at least try and develop, influence industry in the right direction, even if it doesn't happen overnight. And I think this links. I think your question is very important. It links to the point that was made by the panel around the end-to-end customer experience, right? What is a good retail customer experience? And I think if you ask retailers, and I've spoken to a couple of retailers about this, not masses, but I think if you ask retailers, they would say that they want to engage with consumers from the start of the process to the very end of the process. And the payment actually is just something that happens, fairly automatically in the background and isn't a big part of the process. Actually, it's the end-to-end experience that's important to retailers, which I think speaks precisely to your point, which is if that end-to-end process is delivering up information or content that you don't want those children to look at, then actually you should be able to solve that problem earlier. And if the identity is done well, it'll enable the payment automatically during the process. Is that achievable today? No. Is it something that we could aim for? Yes, potentially, I think.
Helen or Sarah, do you want to add to that? No. I think we had another question at the back there.
Yeah, hi. Some good contributions, thank you. I just wanted to ask in relation to creating a trustworthy, seamless customer experience, the degree to which you think that regulation has to be coded for that experience, the degree to which regulation, whether it's the PSD or the forthcoming General Data Protection Regulation, which creates additional obligations, etc., will support the creation of seamless, easy-to-use, trustworthy experiences. And then secondly, if I may, what's your views on who owns the data? You've had your lunch, so you've got to work for it now.
Okay, well, two parts to that question. Do you want to start with the first one, a bit, Sarah?
I think regulation can both be a hindrance and drive innovation, basically. So I think when you think about PSD2, and PSD2 has very much been built around the growth of fintech, and the growth and where customers want to have their data aggregated. So that provides an opportunity for a bank or a fintech to provide a great customer experience. I think there are lots of issues with I think we certainly haven't figured out how PSD will work in practice. How do you protect the customer's data? How do you withdraw the data when you no longer have permission to it? What's the mutual authentication between the individual and the data providers? And I think there are lots of unanswered questions, both between what PSD2 proposes and also what the Open API work proposes through HNT. So I think it can drive innovation and it can also hinder innovation. So I think it's about finding the balance. We've been working with the FCA on a project where we've been thinking about could we take a European identity and use it to open a bank account in the UK. And when we first started the work, which is actually through the OAX, as a plug for the OAX, government said, well, you as a bank, you'll have to manage the risk. And we said, actually, we're not going to manage the risk because our job as a bank is to manage risk. And if you want us to cooperate in a federated, identity ecosystem, we have to work through the implications of that. And the interesting thing is that the FCA were very open to have that conversation. We haven't got any of the answers, but it was we're having a very interesting conversation about where some of the solutions may be. No, we're just understanding the position, but I think it's always a big question. The liability question is massive in all of this, and understanding, because who pays at the end in the liability is going to really decide how successful the market will become. And that's why we definitely advocate a risk-based approach.
Does anybody else want to add to the answer to that question? Well, I think I better answer part of the second part of that question, which everyone else has ducked, which is a bit unfair. Who owns the data? This is an enormous question, and there are many people I know in here who have opposing views on this. Clearly, in some cases, in connection with payments, a bank does own and does protect and is a data protector, whatever it is, controller, that's right, for the data that they've had to collect from people to meet their Know Your Customer obligations. So they have had to ensure that they know who their customers are and that they are operating correctly, and they own that data. I think there's a quite different lot of things, and it's why you can't find some mega answer to everything. When we were talking this morning about using the data held in schools, about children and so on, and the attributes, and then the rather scary thing about how you might monetize all the data about where they do their Google searches, which filled me with utter horror, I have to say. You're then talking about, I think that parents and children would think that they owned the data that is held by the school, or they would wish to have a lot of control over that data. So I think who owns the data is different in different situations, and a lot of that is connected with what the regulatory environment is in that industry. So, as was said, it's quite different if you're using a bank or any kind of bank schema to make a payment, or if you're using a mobile wallet on your mobile phone. Who owns the data in those things is quite different, and who is monetizing that data is quite different. Now, does anybody else, now you know what the question was and you've heard my inadequate answer, want to answer that a bit better? Oh. No?
The individual obviously owns the data, but like all of these things, we pass it across to different people at different times. I was registering for a bank's online system the other week, I think just look at a mortgage statement, I think it was. And the bit that really annoyed me, I didn't actually finish it off in the end, because they then wanted to know my favourite film and my favourite place and what my favourite year was and so on. And it sort of suddenly felt as if there were things that were suddenly going to be out there with a brand that I probably could have trusted. But when you looked at all the T's and C's, then I really was passing across my own personal data, which was then would allow me to log on and identify myself to look at my own mortgage account. And it was things like that which then you really are passing stuff across. So what we're talking about here, I suppose, then is once that data is out there and you've, in theory, let someone else control it for you, you really have lost in sort of ownership of it. So you're right, there is a large challenge there that has to be solved, and I'm sure we've all passed across our personal data almost for someone else to control, and lots of banks will have it, and every time you have a new bank account, you're passing across more information. And I suppose within the T's and C's, I'm not quite sure what we've signed for each bank regarding how they might or might not use it. So, but we have got to have at least some trust and some consistency about that data still belongs to the individual.
Thank you very much. Are there any other questions out here?
I think Pat has one here.
It was only to clarify, I was thinking of the behavioural metadata surrounding payments, which of course, from earlier discussions today, would become attributes used in age verification and identity verification and authentication and authorization. So I was thinking more in terms of that behavioural metadata around payments.
Right. Does anyone want to answer that part of the question? Yeah. You happy to answer that?
I mean, I don't know whether I can answer it, but I think it's where I sort of come back to that point again about user experience, and possibly it links to your first question about the degree to which regulation can play a role in this. And, possibly if there is some regulation around this, then it does provide some framework around some consistency in this space, which can ultimately help the user and put the control back in the space of the user to make those decisions. I think one of the issues that it's just increasingly difficult as a consumer to have transparency over how the data you're giving is going to be used, because it's just so wide and varied, and that you have to literally trawl through terms and conditions actively looking for it to understand how it's going to be used, which it's sort of isn't good enough. So I don't know that there is a clear answer to this, but I think possibly the regulation can actually start to play a bit of a role in that space.
Does that answer your question adequately? No.
So maybe the banks will come together and establish a self-regulatory trust framework in payments then, because regulation takes a long time.
Yeah, I'm not sure about that, if I'm honest, and that's speaking on behalf of myself rather than behalf of Barclays. I think the issue is that the drivers for change in different organisations are different. The strategic imperatives for different organisations are different, and I think that coalescing that group of organisations to do the one thing the one way is going to be very difficult. In relation to the thing you talked about with the behavioural metadata, what's really interesting to think about the growth of things like mobile banking. So we have, we're about 10 million customers, active customers, about 4 million of them have our banking app. Most of them use it more than once a day. It's a pretty amazing statistic, and most customers, the drive towards online payments, mobile payments, in particular mobile banking, is huge and is only continuing to grow. And if you think about the behavioural data, it's a question of how we use. I think the question is it's about the organisation and how they use it, and then being, what we see ourselves as custodians of the customer's data, and our job is to protect that data. But if I know, through having better understanding about the use of the mobile phone, the way the customer uses the phone, how they use it, when they use it, I can then connect that to the individual and say, and then I see something that's out of bounds, so they're using it in a different country, they're using it in a different way, then I can take steps to protect that customer's money and that customer's data. And so it's up to the organisations to be the custodians of their customers' data and use that data to protect them and help them get on with their lives.
But that must also mean you've got to have transparency as well. So as a customer, you've got to be able to actually really understand what that bank's or the company that you're using, what their stance is, how they'll protect you as well. So every organisation, therefore, has got to at least be transparent with the customer and make sure, therefore, that that relationship is fully understood.
I think the short answer is yes. I think it's actually really difficult because you've got a bunch of people in this room and we're really interested in identity and payments and attributes. But the guy walking down the street, he doesn't care. He just wants to be able to get on with his life and do it as easy as possible because he doesn't really care about these things. He cares about his football club and his family and his holidays. And so that's the difficult point. We can be as transparent, but the customer has to want to engage in that. And I think that's a very difficult task. To find a way to make sure the customers understand these things is not easy. And I don't think anybody's solved that.
No, but I think there are simplistic examples of this working today. So, for example, most customers people that have a credit card probably realise that the credit card issuer is monitoring transactions and would expect, but they would expect that, and I'm talking about, maybe not everyone, but a much bigger proportion of the population than this kind of select audience here, would expect that if a card was used, in a strange place at an unexpected time, that the issuer would notice, right? Because that's something that happens a lot, right? So, I think that maybe gives us a clue as to what could happen here. What you don't want to do is to bombard consumers with, forms to give permissions, and they just won't understand it. What there needs to be is a development of a relationship. It needs to be built around trust. It links very much to brand, and it links to banks, not being seen to, but actually operating in a responsible way. And I think over time, the role of banks as identity providers, I think that's a sensible thing to aim for, And I think you have to be in a position where we don't need consumers or citizens to understand the minutiae of this. They need to just know, okay, I'm dealing with my bank here. It's definitely my bank. I've got all the relevant signals coming off my phone or whatever to tell me it's my bank, and that enables me then to have a level of trust in what I'm doing.
But I think in the changing world with the growth of fintech and all those things, the importance of things like mutual authentication is going to become very important because there might be an organisation that you think can present your data in the right way, but you need to trust them, and it may not be your bank in the future with things like PSD2 and
I was using banks as an example to put it into your lap, right?
I know. Well, we're clearly in favour of it, right? But what I'm saying is, in the future, when people, if you think about, you talk to millennials, they'll trust Facebook with their payment data. Like, we've done research about these things, and they have a different view, such a different view than we're all sort of a bit older and a bit more conservative and all those things. But if you speak to the millennials and how they think about their data, they know what they're doing with it, and then they kind of think, well, I know what they're going to do with it, but I'll get something in return. So
here's an interesting question. So nowadays, if you speak to like us, and you say to someone, who do you bank with, right? People will give you an answer, right? Because they have a recognised bank. In the future, will we ever get to the point where you could say to someone, who manages your identity? And they go, it's this identity provider.
I hope so. I hope it's Barclays.
Are there any more questions from the floor? It's actually quite difficult for me to see. So, sorry? Oh, right. Merlin.
Hello? Is this on? Right. Now, I'm just going to make the statement that my children actually are quite careful with their data, but then they're mid-20s up to just early 30. There came a stage where they began to realise that this was, dangerous. They started unwinding things from Facebook and everything like that. So I think things may change. I think we might be reporting a little bit about, a previous generation when everything was very new. I think there's an area of caution now starting to come in, but I may be wrong.
Yes, I certainly have found with my children that there's an age-related caution that comes in. Philip, I think.
Yes. Just to follow up Merlin's point, this morning the Drum carried some market research on millennials showing that 63% of them now use ad blocking to block out their stuff. I think that situation, that the attitudes of the millennials are changing quite rapidly, and we ignore those changes at our peril.
I think that's quite true. As I can't see other hands up there, I wanted. Oh, right. Sorry. One of our many.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, Alistair Kelman. I've got more a comment more than anything. These days, I sometimes get a call from my bank, and it says, "Good morning, Mr. X, me or whatever it is. Want to do some checks on you and the rest of it." Now, my response is, "Thank you. Could you tell me what my balance is in the pence in my balance at the moment in my current account?" What? Well, you're calling me. There should be caller line identification. I can't actually see who you are and the rest of it. You want some personal information, you're going to go through security. Well, I'm going to take you through security. And I get rung off at that stage. I think that what I'm doing is the way that millennials are going to go. That as such, after LIBOR and all the other issues and the rest of it, the trust relationship with banks has broken down. And they have to win this back yet again. And before they do so, public attitudes are going to change, and they're going to start saying, right, we want to be on an equal basis. You want to use my data, then you adhere to my level of security. There's going to be greater use of two-part security. People are going to be prepared to share data if it is on a fairer basis.
Would you like to come on?
I completely understand your point about the identifying you and we're calling you. I think I don't know what the answer to those questions are. I think we as an organisation, as organisations have to manage we have strict regulations about know your customer. So before we have to speak to you, we have to make sure that you are the person we think you are. So about the KYC regulation and the any bank's risk-based approach will determine how they manage that process. I think. I think potentially around, will we move to a world where you take your KYC with you? So if the Norwegian model, whereas you have a bank ID, you can use it to interact with government, you can use it to interact with different banks. Will that model develop here? I'm not sure, but I think. And as I said before, I do believe that mutual authentication is important because that's how you create real trust. It's not about me proving something about myself. It's about us creating a trusted environment to have our relationship and to manage the transaction we need to manage. And I think that's fair.
I know I'm going to try and keep to time. I'd like to just bring us back and ask someone in the audience, and I know there are some people in the audience from the adult entertainment area, whether they feel that they can do age verification adequately in relation to payments. Because I know that the gambling industry does do that to a reasonable extent, or whether you feel that they should be unlinked.
I mean, it's been said this morning already that payment is not necessarily part of the process of accessing adult content, so I think it should be an option, that it can be bound to payment. So I'm quite surprised by this panel that there is a reticence, really, to engage with associating an age attribute with the payment process. It seems that you're looking to a regulator to impose something on you. Talk of the fintech community, but I think we're lacking innovation in this space altogether. And I'm surprised that we're not seeing more back from this panel, really, in terms of solutions.
So I don't think we're looking for the regulator. I know within our bank we're thinking about how do we connect an attribute, whether it's address, age, whatever it might be, to a payment. I think it's a question of, I think for us it was thinking about, it's a liability question actually more than anything else. If I'm passing an age attribute through and something's happened now, you know, we're organisations where human processes fail, let's be honest. So if something's happened in the organisation, the KYC hasn't been done properly, and that's possible. KYC could have been done years ago, could have been done yesterday. I think some of it is about the risk. So banks as organisations manage huge amounts of risk. They're heavily regulated, and so sometimes that environment for more risk-taking is limited. But I think the ability to connect an attribute with a payment will definitely happen, and it's just a question of, you know, and I think it's a short to medium term thing that will happen, and we as a bank are already looking at it.
I just want to come back and say that for the payment space to work, you've got to look at where the point of collaboration is, and I don't think the payments industry has got a particularly good track record of collaborating to achieve innovation. And if we look over the last 10 years, whenever there has been any innovation, normally there has been some sort of regulatory stick or push. And if the payment systems are underpinned by standards and collaboration, then if you are to get age verification, you know, linked to, part of, then you know, you've got to have something to at least create the spark. Now, whether that is true regulation, whether it's just government setting a sort of ambition. So if we take the adult industry, then if there is government regulation coming down, age verification is required, and if there is a benefit to that happening within the payment flow, because that might be helpful, and that's a good place to start, and there are existing bits of plumbing that are there already, then that might need that regulator. And the PSR as a regulator has got an innovation, you know, remit to do something as well. So I'm not saying it has to be the regulator, but just the way the payment systems work, you would need some form of collaboration to at least get consistency.
I think you need to think about the business model as well. I think I could say this. I think a lot of banks, a lot of payment processors, a lot of people in the payment space are thinking about identity, thinking about the role that they could take, and obviously for them, they're looking at how such services can be brought to market in a way that makes sense. So if there is something like adult entertainment that say, you know, we're prepared to pay a sensible amount for doing age verification, I would have thought that would be a sensible conversation that could be had. I mean, I'm not from a bank, I'm just a consultant, right? But I would hope that would be the case.
Thank you very much. Are there any final points that each of you want to make? Well, thank you very much. I think you've been a great panel, and I'd ask you to thank people in the usual way.